Welcome back to East to West. I'm Josh Benedict.
And I'm LJ Nadal.
We have a special episode here today. This is not your normal East to West podcast. We feel like East to West is always focused on looking outwardly, expanding our minds globally, expanding our perspectives and horizons. From a Christian worldview, LJ and myself are both followers of Jesus, but at some point there needs to be some sort of inward reflection. And so that is what today's special segment focuses on. We're focusing on reconciliation and inward reflection and inspection, specifically within the race relations and racial tensions that we have here in the United States of America. And to help us discuss, break it down, all things race issues, racial tensions, reconciliation, we have brought Jalen Winfield in.
So I'm good to be here. Glad to be here with East to West. That's such a catchy name, man. I love that name, East to West. My name is Jalen Winfield. I'm from Southern Pines, North Carolina. I'm a senior at Liberty University, and I'm graduating this May, so thank God. No more blackboard, anything like that, but trying to head to graduate school. So,
Jalen, you're going to do great in grad school or wherever the Lord takes you, and
Thank
this
you.
man is a very talented spokesperson, spokesman, whether it's spoken word, poetry. I hear you do a little bit of rap, so maybe some bars later on. I don't
I
know.
was 12, bro. I retired, man.
But you're a great speaker. We're communication peers and students together, and so I'm really excited for what the future holds. But we already mentioned what today's discussion, roundtable discussion, is going to be about. But the reason that got LJ and myself to this is that as we've been looking through what's going on in the world, every single, it seems like, event that we want to cover has to do with ethnic tension. There are people that don't like other people. There are riots, there's ethnic genocides, there's persecution because somebody looks different, sounds different, comes from a different background. And we just started to realize, wow, there's a lot of things that we feel like is happening on an everyday basis inside the U.S. is happening around the world. So this is not just specific to just the U.S. It might look different. It might come out in different, rear its ugly head in different forms. But this is something that we need to take some time to look inwardly and reflect inwardly. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to try to look at a why, how, and what questions, and so we can break this down. So just to get us going, the first question is, like, why is this conversation relevant? Why now to us as Americans, but also as followers of Jesus?
Well, I would say, just coming from my perspective, that it's important to have these conversations because they're important conversations. And what I mean by that is we don't want to have people continue to kind of make the same mistakes that we've made throughout history. And you could say that this is the best time to be alive, just all around the world, because we have access to so much knowledge and information sharing and connection to people that we never could have before. And I think that with this progress that we've experienced, I think we need to understand more about each other in ways that we have capability to now. I would also say that it's important because the world is becoming more and more polarized too. And people are looking at each other before they even have a conversation. Before we even get to that, we're putting labels on people, and we're not even able to address one another in a civil way, or even be able to, before I even have a conversation with you, I label someone that I'm not going to even be able to get through this person because they're from X, Y, and Z, those type of prejudices. So from my perspective, I think to help unify people and bring people together is just so important, because how do we move forward if we can't even talk to one another?
Just bouncing off of LJ, I think one of the things that what makes this topic so relevant is that I believe that there's an old scar in this country that has not quite healed yet. And in order for that to heal, we have to medicate a little bit better than what we're doing. So with that being said, that is what makes it relevant. It's just that the brokenness that we have and things not being healed, things not being said, if you look at the word reconciliation, it's basically a relationship.
Yeah.
So at one point or another, a relationship has to be mended because once it was broken. So with that being said, our nation is at a broken point where we have racial tensions. And if you talk to, I think I was talking to my granddad, and we were just talking it up, and we were talking about racial tensions, and to him, like, nothing has changed. To an 87-year-old man, nothing has changed. That's sad. I mean, I'm pretty sure people would argue that, but I think it's changed in like a legalistic way, but not more so in a human way, in the heart.
True, like we have more policies and like more, I guess, like procedures and things like that for dealing with like different diversity and different things like that. Like we don't have Jim Crow laws or anything like that anymore. It's illegal to, do some of these really terrible things that we were able to before, but yet still have people say that they don't feel like they can
Right.
like make it in our country and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, this is, I don't want to say it's humorous, it's ironic when people say, why are we having this conversation? And then my freshman year, I'm sitting in the dorm room watching riots in Baltimore and burning. You know what I mean? If you ask in the question why, and you don't open your eyes and see that something's happening, you might not even agree with what people are doing, right? But if protests are happening, if looting, if people are dying, if people are protesting, something hasn't changed, right? Like maybe like you said, LJ, superficially something has changed, but there's still a core problem at the heart, right? So clearly, I hope everybody can recognize and identify that this conversation is relevant. It needs to happen, and I think we could even go as far to say that it hasn't been happening enough recently. And that's kind of ironic, we're all followers of Jesus in this room and everything. And this isn't just a new situation. It goes back even to Bible times, to the Word of God, in that the Jewish people had trouble with Samaritans, right? They viewed them as half-breeds. They viewed them less than human, and Jesus completely met that head on by talking to the woman at the well. The Jewish people thought that the gospel was just for them, and then Peter in Acts gets called to a Gentile's house. You know what I mean? There's really, if you want to break things down as race, there's like two races. It's Jew and Gentile. And if you're not Jewish, you're Gentile, right? So everybody's kind of lumped into that if you're looking at biblically. I think something I just want to read real quick from 2 Corinthians, which has kind of been this whole like anthem cry, I think, of reconciliation, comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 5 in verse 14. And it says, "For Christ's love compels us, since we have reached this conclusion. If one died for all, then all died. And he died for all, so that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but the one who died for them and was raised. From now on, then, we do not know anyone in a purely human way. Even if we have known Christ in a purely human way, yet we no longer know him in this way. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old thing has passed away, and look, new things have come. Everything is from God, who reconciled," there's that word, reconciled, "us to himself through Christ, and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them. And he has committed the message of reconciliation to us. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, certain that God is appealing through us. We plead on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. He made the one who did not know sin to be sin for us, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him." And so I think it's really cool that as we are reconciled to God for a sin problem, right, the ultimate problem in our world. I know Ben Watson, the football player, really talked about that, especially in his Facebook post that went viral a couple of years ago, that now we have this ministry, we have this mantle to be ministers of reconciliation. And that just blows my mind, because I think normally when I think of being a believer, I'm like, oh, okay, I share the gospel. No. You're a minister of reconciliation, right? You get to go out and reconcile people, not only to each other, but to God. And so I think that kind of encapsulates why the conversation is relevant. And so now that we've established that it's relevant, I guess the big question, and this is the one that everybody squirms with, like how if anything have you experienced racial tension or reconciliation, either side of the coin, in our personal lives?
There's varying degrees of discrimination, and I have a very unique kind of understanding of, just coming from my background and my family and the way that I was raised and the way my dad came to the United States and everything, and the way he interacted with the different people here, and personally, I come from a background that hasn't experienced persecution, or
Gotcha.
discrimination. Of course, there is like some profiling things and stuff like that. When you have skin, that's a certain color, you know.
Well, let me jump in there real quick. LJ, we're a podcaster, everything. So paint a picture. Yeah, paint a picture for people of what you're talking about in profiling.
A rich caramel. No, I'm kidding.
Rich
A
caramel.
golden caramel. No,
Tall, dark,
an
and
almond.
handsome.
Yeah. I don't even know. No. Is that what you're saying?
Long walks on the beach. And,
No, not a profile like that. Before you see someone, before you hear what they have to say, you see them first.
Mhm.
But personally, for me, I mean, other than some cosmetic things, some
Right.
superficial things that they don't get to, then people get to know me. And they're like, oh, this guy's like a giant nerd or something like that, or he likes things that are a little bit more like, not what I expected or whatever. And I think people are a lot like that because people are very complex and, they have different tendencies and different things like that. And so that's my background that's where I kind of come from it. But I also have the background of, and I think, Jalen, you're going to talk a lot about it too, of kind of seeing and having friends that are living more in like a struggle, where every day it's more so about like, how do I get through today? As opposed to where I come from, having more of it's not perfect home life or anything like that. We still have a lot of trouble, but coming from a more supportive system, and then seeing my friends and other family and people that don't have that,
Right.
And so you can
Right.
probably talk more about that.
Yeah, just like for me, I had a lot in my past where I can tell you numerous of stories where I've been like racial profiled and I've kind of encountered prejudice and things like that, and I almost, I guess, got threatened, especially kind of life threatening kind of situation. But
Wow, dang.
I mean,
Yeah,
we have time,
yeah,
so if you ever
yeah.
want to elaborate in a story or
I got
whatnot,
you.
feel free to go for
man.
it.
I got you. But I remember, man, this one time I was 18 years old, man. I was just growing up. I remember my dad had to like sit me down and like explain to me like as a young kid like this is what you're going to have to go through, and being like an African American and but not everybody is like, is like that and things like that. I remember I was outside of this apartment. It's called Highlands Apartments in Southern Pines, North Carolina, bro. And so this I was playing with this kid, and he was a white kid, and he said the N word. I didn't even know what it was. I did not know what it was, and so I go in and I talk to my mom. I was like, Mom. I ain't say mom. I was like, Mama,
Yeah.
And so I said, this boy just called me, the N word, and she was like, what? Who? And I said, it's Travis across from the street. And so my dad comes in, and my mom says, do you want to tell him? And my dad said, I think it's time, to kind of like have that talk early with him. And so my parents had to actually discuss like what the word meant and about like certain things that I was going to encounter. And my dad always told me, not everybody is like that. Not everybody is going to be like prejudiced towards you. So don't, walk through life thinking that everybody's going to be that way because they're not. And so when I was 18 years old, like I was walking down the street in Pine Bluff, North Carolina, and I was dribbling a basketball, and I see this white pickup truck. It had a 2x4 in the back, and the reason why I remember it is because when he actually stopped his truck, it created a skid mark, and the 2x4 it hit the back of the glass, and it made like a loud noise. And when he popped out of the truck, he asked me. He said, "You got a problem, boy?" And when he hopped out of the truck, he had something in his hand. I didn't know what it was, and he kept trying to initiate, kind of like kind of like it's almost kind of like a threatening way. And he was a really, really big guy. I think he was in like his 40s or 50s, and it just scared the mess out of me. He had like what's it called, a Confederate flag in the back, and so that just kind of threw me off too as well. And being 18, it was like you kind of puffing up your chest a little bit when you're 18 and you're like, I got this. Like, if anybody would ever try to come at me in a certain way, like, like I got this. But in that moment, like, I felt so less than a man because I didn't take up for myself because I was so scared about what if I did try to fight this man and he literally like gets the best of me. And
Yeah, like what do you do in a situation like that?
it's
crazy.
just like, man, I walked away and kept walking, and he just kept cursing and kept like kind of just egging on for me to like engage like and fight. I guess try to fight him, or I guess try to like fight him in a way. And it was just a really really scary experience that I never would want my kids to actually experience.
Yeah.
And when he left, like he was like a racial slur towards me.
Wow.
And getting in the truck, and he left. And I waited for like a day till I told my mom, but it kept bothering me.
Yeah.
And it came to the point where I had to tell her.
Because it's more than just a like a look that someone might give you, but like you talked about driving by or something. Like there's an altercation there, man. That's crazy to hear that you had to go through that, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously have not had any situation like that in my life. I mean, speaking for myself, I feel like I've heard a couple stories from people that have
Mhm.
experienced racial tension or altercations or what could have been altercations. Thank the Lord that you were spared from that and whatnot. And every single time I've heard those stories, it's really quiet in the room when those stories are being told.
Yep.
And I think it's because there's a level of not being able to relate.
Late. Yes.
So
That
I
is
wonder,
true.
could you just share a little bit about how what there's tons of emotions going through
Mhm.
people's head, especially for those that can't relate to
Mhm.
stories. How does that? How should people think? What should people be thinking? How can they process emotions? And then also just like it seems like these are common stories. How common from your experience with people you've are these
Yeah.
stories occurring? Just
It's
elaborate on
really
that.
common, man. Like it's gotten to the point where it's normal now. Like I can give you 100 stories. I can give you a story last week, 2 weeks ago, and it's just gotten to the point where it's so normal. And when you are in the classroom, I think I was sharing. Me and Josh actually have a class together. It's a communications class together, and I was sharing experience that I had based off of the rhetorical criticism of "I'm Not Racist" by Jordan Lucas, and I'm the only African American in the classroom, and I know that nobody is going to really understand me fully. But in a way, if you want to understand somebody, you have to first put yourself in that person's shoes. And I actually learned this in acting class. If you want to get into character or try to learn about somebody, what you want to do is you want to state the giving circumstances of that person's situation, which is write down all the facts about them and then put them on yourself and ask yourself, how do I feel right now living in those giving circumstances? And so that's how you're able to kind of touch bases with somebody and say like, hey, like if that happened to him, then me as a person, that can happen to me, even though I'm not like African American or so, but it's just like the thought of like of that, like I am a young man just like he is. I'm 18 just like he is. And so it's like if that can happen to him, then that can happen to me. And so you just have to kind of think about that.
I would just personally say that I think that America, because we're talking about the things we've experienced here in America growing up here, I think it's changed in a way that I think it's become less so about looking at someone as, and we probably talk more about this too, looking at someone as inferior, like just thinking that all African Americans are just inferior, like they're
Mhm.
you know morphing from that more to discrimination based on I don't even know any black people. I've never, but I know a few, or I've heard stories,
yeah.
and so that's how I'm gonna treat the whole every single one I see.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
and that's a type of discrimination that's based on, I think, availability, because you have a small sample size to go off of judging every single individual person based off of. It doesn't even have to be black. It could be like any other type of race, but you know what I'm saying? Where I think it's morphed into that, where you don't see the Jim Crow laws or anything
Mhm.
anymore, but you still see a lot of really bad, discrepancies and things like that based on race. And there's probably still some pockets
Mhm.
of the first thing we talked about where, you grew up in that, man. You grew up in that indoctrination, and it's hard to get out of that. But I think what's the biggest form of discrimination, just talking about people I know,
Mhm.
is it's kind of changed into this like group identity kind of racial profiling type stuff.
Yeah, I think it's also, just to add to what you're saying, LJ. I think it's also that when we stop teaching our kids to look at another person differently, then I think we'll be able to kind of move on. And I think I was taking another communications course, which is debate, and we're actually debating about affirmative action. And she gave her whole debate, and I gave mine, and her debate had some pretty like rough things that she was kind of saying.
I'm
like,
sure, maybe
like,
unintentional,
it's
but
like, it was like, "Dad, girl, like, calm down."
yeah,
But we sat down, and our teacher said, "Okay, like, basically, like, reconcile." And so we had a heart to heart moment where she said, "Teach me," and it threw
yeah,
me off for a minute. I was like, "Teach me?" She said, "I want to learn from your perspective. Teach me. I don't really know about this stuff. Teach me."
wow,
And so I think we have to have that type of attitude as far as like teach me, because sometimes it is like a learned behavior. I have a nephew who's 3 years old, and we were at a Golden Corral, and there was this white kid who he was passing by, and they were the same age, and they hugged each other, like they embraced each other.
yeah,
And my mom got a picture of it, and that just goes to show that they don't know anything about racism. They don't know
yeah,
what that is.
yeah.
And
It's
so
it's been indoctrinated. That
that's
kind
like
of
a
thing.
learned behavior. So
Yeah, I think just the way discrimination, implicit or explicit,
Right.
has kind of changed or morphed in the U.S. over the years has been, yeah, like you said, I grew up in a school, that a side of town that was much more diverse,
Got you.
and who you looked at represented more of what the melting pot of America actually looks like. And LJ and I grew up. We went to the same elementary school together. Didn't really know each other. Got to middle school, knew each other. Played basketball in high school, and half of our school was like 48% Latino,
Hey.
and I think it was like 30% white or something like that, and like 20% African American or what. I'm not sure what the actual demographics were, but regardless, it was not what people think of. I don't know. It was always different because I would go to school and I loved school so much and I'd enjoy things and I felt at home, and then I'd go to my home church and it just looked a little different. You know what I'm saying? Like, and we were talking about this earlier.
feel you.
Our man Lecrae, repping
Pray.
repping the follower of Jesus movement, and he's been in a lot of different news stories recently. But I think one of his lines is like, most segregated part of the week is Sunday morning. Sunday morning, and so even coming to my college here, it's a little different, and so it's been weird that, and I don't know what the results are of that. I don't know if that is a direct result of discrimination or whatnot. I think I'm ignorant in a lot of those things, but it's just like, man, I grew up feeling comfortable in my own skin, and like you said, I feel sometimes like that little boy that gave that other kid a hug, completely oblivious to the real world. You know what I mean? I just grew up, and so I think that's one way that things have changed is all of a sudden I start to view where I went to school, the neighborhood I grew up in, the people I played basketball with, and then I come to a different school, and even sometimes the church services I go to, and I'm like, this looks different. It feels different. People are talking differently, or they're even addressing issues differently and bringing up the idea that things are different. And so I just think that's one way it's kind of shaped and changed over the years.
So the next part of the conversation, I would just want to kind of clarify more about what racism actually is.
Yeah, and the reason that we're kind of trying to ask this question is even through our East to West segments, we found that there's a lot of ethnic tension, ethnic identity differences, which is based upon where people are born, the culture, the language they speak. And oftentimes it feels like in the U.S., this is a color thing. I don't know about what you guys think about that, but it sometimes feels like people divide things into a white-black issue, and it's not the same thing as ethnic identity. So whether or not we want to talk about color, nationality, or ethnicity, can we bounce around this idea of like what is race, what is racism, and some prejudice?
I would probably say that for me, I always like to say ethnicity, because race to me, like, there's only one race. That's the human race.
Oh.
Everything
Yeah,
else is just like it's ethnicity, man. It's just like there's one race. Like there's not a black race. There's
Hey,
not a
keep
white
preaching.
race.
Yeah, the more you read and do research and stuff, you 100% agree with that.
For racism, that's more of like you're basically looking down on somebody because of their race, and you're basically saying I'm superior to you because of I'm different than you, basically.
Another thing we talked about, ethnicity, talk about the group you belong to
Mhm.
as well. And that can play like a pretty huge role in how people treat other people, because you can see another group or another group of people and automatically just assume the worst about the other group of people without
That's true.
getting to know them, because all you see is their ethnic identity, the background, the group they belong to, and things like that. And we saw a lot of that, specifically in the Rohingya Muslim story that we covered in episode 2, Josh, right? With just two groups that didn't get along well, and saw one and the other not as human beings, but as, you know, as just basically people that shouldn't even be in that country, or that they didn't want to associate with, and to the extent of trying to wipe them out and have an ethnic cleansing. That's the extreme of it. But in America, we see people from all different backgrounds, and all different ethnicities and everything. So I think that with this kind of with what America was set up to be was an escape from these different prejudices and religious freedoms and things like that, where it's really become a great melting pot of different backgrounds and different ethnicities and nationalities. It's also bred, I think, ultimately turmoil.
Absolutely. And so I have a question for you two,
Mhm.
and we'll start with you first, LJ. When you're filling out a government form and you get to that one section where it typically says race, nowadays sometimes they're saying ethnicity, which is great. I agree with you, especially if you're looking at things from a biblical perspective, man, like Adam and Eve. We're all from the same blood, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You see, at least this is what I see, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I see white. Every once in a while you'll get a Caucasian word in there. You see black or African American, and then you launch into Asian, Hispanic, Hawaiian Islander, Native American, whatnot. What is going through your head when you see all those boxes and you have to check one? What's going through your head, and then just share a little bit about your personal family background for how you come to make that decision.
Well, taxes suck. And having to do your own and everything sucks. Anyways, we're talking about government forms and different things. Like, they have to have a census of like who's in the country, but it can get pretty crazy, because you're like, is this who I am? Like, is this how people see me? Like, just this one thing, because you have to, unless you're like me. I'm mixed. I could put two, but I put the one that my dad is, because that's the dominant characteristics. But yeah, for me, Hispanic. You see that Hispanic thing, you got to put it, because it does have the asterisk like any Spanish-speaking country. And so, being from the Dominican Republic, my dad. But yeah, I mean, it can be. There's a certain feeling you get when you look at a piece of paper and it's a checklist, and it's race, check 1, or 2, or whatever. But you're basically like, is this who I am? Like, the identity is kind of wrapped up in that, and people can feel a certain way about that. But I think for me, it's not as huge of a deal as I'm sure it is for other people. But I'm sure people look at that form and they're like, man, I'm being singled down. Like, I have so many different characteristics, but race is like kind of like something I have to still like identify with and everything. So.
Like for me, like I definitely have On my mom's side, I have like white and Cherokee, and my dad's a pretty small family. His grandfather came from Baton Rouge, Mississippi. So I don't know
Yeah.
much about him. He died the year I was born, but growing up, and even now, like it's gotten a whole lot better now. I guess for me consciously, I can only speak for myself, nobody else. But for me, looking at the box where it said black
Yeah.
and it says or African American, I'm just like, okay, like I just identify that as the same thing. And for that reason, there was a time that I actually didn't accept being called African American. And the reason why is because there was such a negative like meaning to it. It had like a negative like painting of it. And the reason why is because always kind of in school, you would see in the history books of how Africa was depicted, was kind of painted. And every time you thought of Africa, you thought of people with spears, people who were naked,
Like a third world country.
like a third world country, and I didn't understand the beauty of it until I met my best friends who are my brothers. Till I met Maj, Uchibeki, um, Godson Brown, Chigo. They're from Nigeria, and they asked me a question. They say, what do you call yourself? And I was like, I don't know. I'm not African. And it was like, so you don't believe that, you came from us, we're part of each other. And that helped me to look at things a whole lot more differently, and looking at their culture and them embracing me in their culture and things like that, like teaching me like a lot of things. Like I understood and I appreciated the beauty of Africa. And I'm just going to touch on something that not everybody likes to talk about, or even I guess most people don't know about, but I think there's an inner issue of division amongst Africans and African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of like a self inner issue that goes on in play. Because a lot of times, I guess I'm gonna speak for my my African brothers and what they're saying, and from my experience, like I said, I can't talk about anybody else, but my own experience. There's a lot of hurt there between the two parties, in the sense that you take a person from Africa, they come to the States, and the people who are supposed to accept them the most, they don't accept them. They pick on them. They say things like, horrible things, like the jokes where, the big lip jokes, and man, you're so black jokes. And that really sparks a inner issue of colorism. That's even colorism in the African American community, where it's like if you're lighter, you're the most favored. And so that's more of a self identity issue. And I think and I believe that is one of the effects of racism, prejudice, slavery, because in that time, if you ever look at Martin Luther King, Black is Beautiful, he's basically like uplifting, the black community, and saying that black is always like
And is that,
sinister.
just real quick, is that like the idea that when you had a lighter complexion during the time of slavery, the
Mhm.
favoritism there with like being able to like be in the house and do different things like
Yeah,
that, and
kind of
the negative
favoritism more
stigma.
towards that. And then like even in jobs around that time, it's like if you were the more darker, then you weren't kind of like favored upon,
Right.
things like that. And it was almost if like trying to compete with, basically trying to be white, in the sense of like you're the
Being
most
too white.
closest, like you're the closest to like white, so we're like favor you or whatnot. But I think that has caused like a generational thing where it's more of like self hate. And just speaking from that sense, that's like kind of the division, and that's also a healing, another issue that we can probably talk about and
Wow.
expand upon.
Wow, yeah, that's a lot. That's crazy.
But
Yeah.
yeah.
That's crazy, man. Yeah, and I had this conversation the other day with some guys from work and everything. I'm talking about how we view ourselves as the African American community and everything like that. And me being more so the things that I like and stuff growing up too, and feeling and being involved in sports, which is also a huge kind of thing too. But for me, I felt a little bit inside of the group and also outside as well, because like the things I like to do, and I was like, I gotta read, I gotta improve my writing, 'cause I gotta try to get to college, like,
Yeah.
and all my friends, my black friends and everything too. Just love them all to death, but they would look at me and be like, "Man, what are you doing? Like, why are you studying?" I think it was that, like, I don't know why there's a negative connotation to that kind of stuff, but it was more so like, I think talking about the white being too white type thing. I feel like it's still like a stigma today, 'cause you talk about teasing and things. When you tease someone, or when you like make fun of, like you were talking about, when they come from Nigeria or
Mhm.
from Africa, like that can really cause a lot of identity issues.
Issues it has.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
has.
and I think that's one thing that we talked about, was like healing identity issues based on the different prejudices that we've experienced. And part of that is from, like, it's deep rooted stuff, man.
It
Like,
is,
it's
man.
what you just
It
talked about
is.
was like really deep rooted stuff. That's I think how people, you talked about self hate, and I mean
Self-hate.
that's, if you experience self hate at all, like, it'll put you down. And I think I talked earlier about like and we talked about the why. This conversation is very important. We talked about like people are feeling like hopeless, like like they're struggling,
Yeah.
people are
Yeah.
struggling right now in America, for sure. And Josh, you also talked about something cool too, about having your eyes open to like seeing things that are going on now,
Mhm.
because that's important too, is being able to, okay, now we see these things, our eyes are open to it, and now let's try to heal these things. Because whereas before, I feel like we weren't really talking about it as much.
I could just sit back and listen for hours because I feel like I'm learning so much. You know what I mean? And I
Gotcha.
think this is really the point of what we were trying to do with this segment, is to start a dialogue. You know what I mean? And Jalen, LJ, myself, we've all talked, and this 45 minutes or whatever that we're talking is not going to solve the problems of the world, right? Like, there's so much work to be done, so much hurt out there, so many conversations. But I think the biggest thing that we're trying to communicate to other people is that you have to start somewhere,
You gotta start
right?
a conversation.
And that just kind of makes me think of the story that you shared with the comms classes. You have to come to a place where you're humble enough
Yes, you do.
on
You do
anything
anything. That
and
is
say,
true.
and you have to look at somebody else.
That
And
is
and I
true.
think I just want to take a second to say it's not just a white black issue in the U.S. too, right?
Mhm.
You still got racism and prejudice against Hispanics and
You
Latinos,
do.
right?
You do.
Against
You
Asian
do.
people. I mean, we had a problem in this country against Italians and Irish people at one point. You know what I mean? So, or Arabs or people from the Middle East that look a little different. You know what I mean? So there's always prejudice, and it's literally like saying, metaphorically or even physically, just sitting down and saying, "Hey, teach me."
Yeah.
You
The
know what I
humble
mean?
part I had to learn. I had to definitely learn that. Just a quick story, man. I had to really learn how to be humble. Um, I remember my dad came up. It was around last year, and I was having a really, really tough time here at school because with the elections, the Trump elections, and there's a lot of racial tensions and just the school's like climate. It wasn't really good. It was not good. Like, and that was making me stressful. Like, and being in class and being the only African American in class and talking about like Black Lives Matter and like talking about other issues that are going on like in the black community. And it's just like, man, like I'm about to swing on somebody, and it's like I'm not. I'm. It's like, man, like I don't want to be a violent person, but it's like, man, like this is really like stressing me out to the point where it's like, what do you do? And it got me to the point where I was like, I do not care anymore. Like I'm just done in a sense of like, if anybody comes at me in a certain way, um, like we say, North Carolina, I'm gonna check you.
Yeah.
And so I remember my dad came up and my mom and dad came up and I was talking to them about how Liberty was, and they just listened. They just listened. And we were eating breakfast the next morning, and my mom was telling me some stuff, and she said, the enemy, um, the enemy is trying to get you to a point where he's trying to shut you down. He wants to silence you because he knows like your words can really heal. And my dad, he said, you looked at Malcolm X, you looked at Marcus Garvey, you studied civil rights. He said, you looked at MLK. He said, now look at Jesus. I said, Dad, I already know about Christ. Like, what are you telling me that for? He's like, son, listen, go to the passage where Jesus is basically praying on the mountain, and he comes down, and his disciples are sleeping, and he gets up and he says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And all of a sudden there's a crowd, there's a mob like coming at him with clubs and everything like that. And all the disciples are like, Jesus, you want us to pick up arms, and fight for you. And Simon Peter, he whips out a sword and he cuts the soldier's ear off. And that kind of related to my situation and how I was getting my point across. And it came to the point where if I wasn't humble, then I was very aggressive with it. And so literally, I was cutting off the ears of the people that I was trying to persuade. And so it came to the point where my dad said, listen, if you keep doing that, nobody's going to listen to you anymore. And so with that being said, on both sides, it's like you have to put your sword away, because your sword is not needed for this fight. Maybe another one, but it's not needed for this fight.
Wow. That's powerful, man. That's amazing.
If these mics weren't so expensive and they weren't ours, I'd drop them. That is some very powerful stuff. And, I mean, I just want to thank you again for being here and just helping LJ and I. We've had conversations amongst ourselves, but we're trying to expand this conversation and include other people, and just it's got to be bigger than just one or two people, right? So I just want you to share real quickly before we close out, or as a closeout. You were talking earlier before the show about the idea of a difference between a vision and a dream.
Yes.
With Martin Luther King Jr.
Yes.
Can you just talk about the idea of that and how we can carry on this torch, this mantle, if you will, to be ministers of reconciliation?
Right. For once, not for once, but let's just thank God, for Martin Luther King and the dream that he had. But Martin Luther King had a vision. He accomplished the vision. And I believe that as a leader, you're going to have a vision. And in being a leader, you're basically going to see the vision, and there's going to be people below you who are sometimes not going to be able to see it. But you see the vision, and you're going to complete the vision. A vision is something that you can complete in your time, but a dream is something that you will not complete in your time. You will probably die before you complete your dream. A dream is something that is supposed to be carried on by your kids' kids, and your kids' kids. If you look at, we're talking about where it was, who was it, John and Peter, where they first hear about, Christ, being risen from the tomb, and about how John, the younger, beat Peter. Peter was older than John. And so with that being said, there's also a new generation that takes upon the mantle. And the Bible talks about, I'll pour out my spirit, to the young and the old and things like that. And about how, like, what's it, old man will dream new dreams or something like that. And somewhere around that area, y'all know. Y'all can look it up.
Yeah, look that up.
I don't know what it says, but it's in Acts 2.
It's Acts 2. But definitely, with that being said, we have to carry on the torch, because it's so vital. Because if we don't carry on the torch, then who is? There's not going to be any progress moving forward. I think there has been progress made, but there's also shifts between where an older generation has done its part, and it's time for a new generation to pick up where the old generation left off. So when John was beating Peter, he was literally, that's an illustration of passing off the baton. And so somewhere along the line, we have to pick it up.
I think exactly what you said, just to talk about that, in closing, like the division or the dream isn't complete yet.
Right.
I think that gives us so much hope, though, because it means that we get a chance to make everything come to fruition. that fills me with hope, man. That fills me with like so much more boldness and courage to like, to take the torch, to take the baton and keep going. So yeah, this has been really awesome.
Thank you for inviting me, man. I had a really good time with you guys.
Absolutely.
Likewise.
Jalen Winfield, everybody check him out if you can. How could people stay in contact with you if they wanted to? What's the best way for that?
Oh man, that is crazy. I'm not like famous or anything, but if you want to shoot me an email, you can.
There you go. There you go.
It's jalenwinfield.jw@gmail.com, and that's JALENWinfield.jw@gmail.com. If you want to hit me up, ask me any questions, that's fine. My number is 910-691-5236. This is probably illegal. I don't know.
Hold up. What numbers
Hey, but for real, Jalen, we appreciate you coming
Got
in.
you.
He's a really chill dude, willing to listen, willing to talk, and I love that about you. Thanks again, LJ, for doing your thing and just being here,
LJ.
willing to listen.
I thought LJ was black, man.
Hey, don't listen to him.
Hey, hit that like on Facebook, East to West Podcast. We're now on YouTube, East to West Podcast. Please like, comment, share. This is a conversation that has started, and if you're not a part of it, you're missing out. And you gotta really be part of the conversation. And we're moving from a place of conversation to a place of action. So thank you for this discussion on reconciliation, and we will see you guys next time.